So these past several weeks, we've been exploring what it means to follow a sense of call or vocation in your life. And central to that endeavor, we suggested, was the need to trust God to be who we are, to shine, to lead, to speak, and to go where God sends us. So last week, we actually concluded the series with a special guest. Our very own Emma Brooke came and shared with us her story, her call story of wanting to become a teacher. Now, happily, I can report that Ms. Brooke, is now, in fact, a middle school language arts teacher. She happens to be one of our son's teachers, and she is very, very well loved by students and colleagues alike. To know Emma is to know that she had this idea to become a teacher since the age of 8. And to see her as a successful and beloved educator today seemed to clearly and plainly answer the question that our sermon series was posing. Is it possible that trusting God with our life is the safest and surest way to discover our true self, who we're really meant to be? Well, yes, it certainly seems that it does. However, what struck me in listening to Emma's story last week was the fact that her journey to become something that she truly felt drawn to become did not happen in a straight line. Not at all. As she explained, she went through some really very, very rough patches with difficulty and disappointment and doubts that she was even on the right path at all. In fact, it seemed that her way was paved with all kinds of stops and starts and uncertainty and frustration. And yet, she moved forward. It seemed to me, as I listened, that her story could be any one of our stories. Because which one of us has not experienced crippling doubt, false starts, tremendous failures, even while we thought we were on the right path? So as I listened, I found myself wondering, what do we even mean when we say trust God? And maybe more importantly, what does that even look like in our daily life? Our reading today, as luck would have it, from the prophet Jeremiah, is all about trust. So this morning, let's take a look at what it might mean to trust anybody, let alone trust God, and how such a connection and relationship is forged. So the prophet Jeremiah was called to the very unhappy task of announcing the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. Life around him had pretty much fallen apart. Let's just say that it was certainly not going well, and there didn't seem to be a good deal of trust to go around. And as we heard, the prophet sets up this stark contrast, the way life can be depending on who or where or on whom we place our trust. He insists that those who trust human assertions of power will suffer in hard times, while those who trust in God possess this deep resource, and it will allow them to flourish even in times of drought. The problem, though, as I was reading this prophecy again and again, I thought, well, this doesn't really seem to be true. It's certainly not our human experience, is it? Because our world is filled with people who rely on human grit and strength. And they have the will to do so, and they succeed in some manner because of it. I don't think any of us can deny that. Military power, technological innovation, social status, and economic achievement all tempt us to see those very things as the ultimate sources of security and personal meaning. So how is this advice even true, let alone helpful? Well, if we take a closer look at the text, we see that the Hebrew word Jeremiah uses for trust is bidashan, to lean on, to be safe, to feel confident. And in this form he uses it, it's a verb, and therefore it must have an object. Jeremiah is not talking about a belief in propositions or ideas. Rather, he's encouraging a kind of commitment that is forged within a relationship. The prophet proclaims that misplaced confidence may prove to be shallow, unrooted, and eventually unsatisfying, even dangerous. Trust, which he says comes from the human heart, only grows within a mature and tested relationship, one that we can lean on and feel safe and confident in. Still, as I pondered my language art skills of verbs and objects, I thought this is only going to be easy to grasp if we first consider our own personal relationships. So think of somebody that you trust. What led you to trust them? Or maybe it's easier to consider somebody in whom you've lost trust. What led to that rupture? I was talking with some friends recently about how we come to trust the people that we love and care for. Specifically, we were wondering about the adolescents in our lives who are stumbling their way into adulthood. How do we trust them to make mistakes, yet profit by them? To fail just enough to generate resilience, but not so much that they become permanently broken. As different as we are as parents, those of us gathered, and as different as our collective 11 adolescents are, one thing was immediately clear to all of us. Trust is built incrementally, bit by bit. We all considered ourselves, and maybe you do too, to be people who try to see the best in others and are prone to be trusting of them. And yet we knew that trust is never a once and for all proposition. Charles Feltman, the author of The Thin Book of Trust, describes trust as choosing to risk making something that you value vulnerable to another person's actions. And in the case of our children, that may be that they are vulnerable to their very own actions. Still, we agreed that trust comes in a series of small moments, and it must be built over time. So I was thinking of it, and I came up with this image, this jar that I have of little colored pieces of sea glass. If you think of the jar filled with each piece of glass representing a moment, every experience we have deepens our relationships and slowly fills up this jar until we notice that we can be vulnerable with this person. We can take more risks. We can allow them to take more risks. We have confidence that their bounce back factor will in fact work and work well. It's what it means to trust them. Our jar, their jar, is filled. So if we stretch this marble jar image to its largest, most expansive relationship that we can imagine, the larger story in which we live and move and have our being, I think it's easier to see that trust in God develops the same way. It means that you're allowing your life to be vulnerable, to surrender to something larger than yourself. You have confidence in that energy that you feel humming around you and around the world, and you have a reverence for that hum. It's a reverence for life. It's not distant or detached or indifferent to your pain or uninvolved in your very real struggles. But instead, it's present in and among, and it's for us. It is for us. In fact, it has our best interest at heart. That's why Jeremiah writes that we are not to trust in mere mortals, but in something more eternal and long-lasting. He's talking about the trust that you have, however stifled or faint or repressed, that hope is real, that things are headed somewhere, and that somewhere is good. It's far better, he says, to trust in the Lord. And what he means is that it's better to trust in something larger than yourself, even if you come to know that through another person. Trust in the Lord. Now, we may agree that it is really lovely and grounding to say or to sing that we are trusting in God and surrendering to the Lord. But what does that look like? Will we hear a still small voice, or will there be this large booming sign? How will our marble jar be filled? Well, as Emma continued to tell her story last week, and it is available on media for you to watch if you weren't here, it became clear that the confidence she required to lurch forward came in small moments. A humble encouragement here, a supportive victory there, experiences that built on themselves, creating this web of trust, each adding up to a softer place on which she could fall the next time a stumble occurred. Throughout it all, her story, though, continued to move forward. This happened, and then that happened, and then another thing happened, and then something else, and before you knew it, there was this trust that she expressed, a relationship with her larger story. Trust in God. Author and pastor Frederick Buechner recalls a similar kind of story. I would call it a marble jar story. He writes, "I remember sitting parked by the roadside once. I was terribly depressed and terribly anxious about my daughter's illness and what was going on in our family at the time. When out of nowhere, a car came down the highway with a license plate that bore on it the one word out of all the possible words in the dictionary that I most needed to see exactly then. The word was trust." He continues, "What do you call a moment like that? Something to laugh off as a kind of joke that life plays on you every once in a while? The Word of God? I am willing to believe that maybe it was something of both. But for me, at that moment, it was an epiphany. Trust. He continues, well, the owner of the car turned out to be, as I suspected, a trust officer in a bank. And not long after, having read an account I wrote of the incident, he found out where I lived and brought me that license plate, which to this day sits propped up on my bookshelf in my house. It's rusty around the edges, and it's a little battered, and it is also as holy a relic as I have ever seen. Moments like this get us out of what Jeremiah calls our mortal mind and reminds us that we are swimming in a much bigger river, a larger pool. And if we are paying attention, we will notice those moments, and they will fill our jar. At the end of Jeremiah's message today, he leaves us with this bold reminder, saying that the heart is devious above all else. Well, I really struggled with the end of that prophecy. I almost tempted myself to cut it out altogether. But as I really prayed and thought about that one last verse, I thought, we don't need to consider ourselves underhanded, evil, or utterly depraved, as Calvin would have said, in order to admit that it is so easy for us to deviate from the love that loved us into being. It is all too common for us to meander willingly or unwillingly into unconsciousness. We're human after all, but then we're going to miss out on those moments, and our jar will be empty. And that is why we're invited again and again and again and again to lean into the very energy in which we live and move and have our being, allow it to carry us, to lean into it with trust, to be guided and rooted in such a way that the winds will not knock us down. Because we know that the pathway is often rocky, and our way may still at this moment feel very confusing. And maybe we're uncertain, and maybe we don't even know what the goal is in sight. But we find that we're more able to withstand the trials when they do come. And in and throughout it all, we somehow find confidence, a resilience, and a trust that we're willing to surrender to submit, as our final hymn will request, submit ourselves to a story that is larger than any one of us, but that we participate in the confidence that it's going somewhere, and that somewhere is good. In God we trust. Amen.